Inside America's Boardrooms, the informational show for board members and corporate secretaries. Brought to you with knowledge partners NASDAQ, the Center for Audit Quality, and PwC. Along with content contributors Equilar, Meridian Compensation Partners, Wilson Sonsini Goodrich and Rosati, R.R. Donnelly, and the Society of Corporate Secretaries and Governance Professionals.
Welcome to this edition of Inside America's Boardrooms. I'm TK Kerstetter, the CEO of Boardroom Resources, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to the show. We're filming again today from the NASDAQ Entrepreneurial Center in San Francisco. It's a great nonprofit facility that helps mentor and train entrepreneurs. And if you ever get a chance to be out this way, you have to stop. It's quite a facility. So we have an interesting show today where we have a guest who he defines himself as a shareholder advocate. That's how we define him as well. Some might call him an activist. But let me introduce James McRitchie, who's the publisher of CorpGovNet.net and as I explained, a shareholder advocate who's very passionate about shareholder rights. So, Jim, you've always been active in the shareholder space. You aren't like a hedge fund necessarily or a institutional investor. You're an individual.
Right.
So I think a good place for us to start is to find out a little bit about the background, how you came up with CorpGov.net, and then we'll get into a little bit about you with your shareholder proposals and stuff. But let's start background. Fill us in on sort of what your background was leading up to this passion for shareholders.
Sure, and thanks for inviting me. It's a great show. I've been watching it for years, so the old one and the new one. So my academic career, I was basically studied corporate governance and I got a grant from the NIMH to study what kinds of corporate forms work best for not only shareholders, but also employees and society at large. But my main career was as a government regulator. And so I worked for the government, but I worked with industry, basically writing laws and regulations. But after a while, I got to thinking it's very difficult to regulate corporations. I mean, I would sit around with the corporations writing the laws that regulate them. So I thought, okay, let's look at CalPERS, let's look at from the inside. How can you regulate corporations from the inside? So I wrote the site and posted it in order to convince CalPERS to form a corporate governance unit. So I was trying to show them I know something about this subject. And they did start a corporate governance unit, but instead of hiring me, they hired their own legislative director for that same position, which in the end was kind of good because then I could criticize CalPERS and I could also criticize corporations as well. So, but most of my effort as a shareholder advocate have been around rules. So majority voting for directors is a major theme of mine. But the biggest thing that I've been working on I filed a petition with the SEC in 2002 for proxy access. And that helped get the ball rolling. And we had 3 different rulemakings. And anyway, finally we are now back to having the kind of proxy access we had back in the 80s before they took it away.
Well, CorpGov.net is a great site. It's been around for years. I'd recommend people go because it's just a good resource of all the information that you've collected. Great place to become educated. So jump from that to when you started. I assume you were either buying shares to permit you to participate with the company. Talk a little bit about your investment side, because I know you've actually filed some shareholder proposals at companies. Talk about your philosophy and your efforts in that area.
Well, I've been a shareholder since junior high, so I've been a shareholder for a long time. And so I have not in the past anyway, have not bought stock so that I could be an advocate at that company. Although right now I am starting to do that, and I'm doing that with financial firms mostly. And I'm doing that because I've come to the conclusion that that's where the real problem lies, is in proxy voting by large financial firms like Fidelity, Vanguard, BlackRock. Basically, if we could get those firms to vote in a way, if the members actually knew how the firms were voting, not the members, but the investors in those funds knew how the funds were voting, they probably wouldn't like it. Like, say, for example, a lot of those funds, they've signed on to the UN PRI, the Principles for Responsible Investment. And those principles call for disclosure. That's one of the main things that the UN and the principles stand for, is disclosure. And you have firms like BlackRock signing on to the PRI, but then when it comes to their own proxy voting, say a shareholder puts in a proposal on, we want you to disclose what measures you're taking towards addressing climate change, or we want you to disclose how where your political donations go, or where your lobbying efforts go. Well, they vote against those things all the time. So how can you sign on to the PRI and vote against those things all the time? So I think, my efforts, I'll be filing resolutions at those financial companies so to try to bring harmony to what they say in public and how they act when they vote.
Well, you and I have some humorous history going back actually many years ago, but I'll never forget the title of one of your blogs was Vote TK Off the Island. And if I remember correctly, it was during a time when there was being asked for a lot of disclosure, and you and I had sort of different opinions about what was happening. But I must tell you, I didn't take it personally, but it was pretty humorous among the ranks as that filtered out through sort of media outlets. But the real issue that I want to ask you about back then, comparing it to today, and let's look at today, that pendulum back there was swinging wildly, okay, about between board rights, company rights, and shareholder rights. When you look at all that's happened between, in those last 10 years, and you look at where we stand today, where is that pendulum as far as you're concerned, and what's your feeling relative to the rights on both sides?
Well, as far as boards versus shareholders, those rights, I would say that boards still have, the pendulum has not yet swung to a point where shareholders are on an equal footing. Just take one example. Very few shares now are registered. So about 2% of shareholders own registered shares. And registered shares are protected when a company files a proxy and you get that proxy as a registered shareholder. There are rules that apply to that proxy. But with regard to VIFs, which is voter information forms, which we get, Broadridge has interpreted that to mean that you don't have any of those rights. So for example, if you get a proxy on the ballot that comes with the proxy, if I have a proposal in that says proxy access, it has to say something clear and objective like proxy access. On a voter information form, which is now goes out to 98%, they can say anything they want. So they can say, for example, a shareholder proposal which is opposed by management. They can give that as the title instead of proxy access. So people that, and of course, the vast majority of retail shareholders just throw their proxies away. But even those that vote, if they vote, oftentimes they'll just look at the ballot. They won't go to the proxy, dig in, and find the information they really need to vote intelligently. So if they're just looking at the ballot and they see a shareholder proposal opposed by management or opposed by the board, well, they're likely to just check a no on that. So there aren't those kinds of, and then also if you vote one item on a voter information form and you leave all the rest of the items blank, all those other items get voted per the board's recommendation. So, you know, there's not a balance.
Yeah. Is it fair to say, though, that you might never be satisfied knowing, because look at majority voting, proxy access is moving down the pike. Chairman White talked about universal ballot. I mean, there's clearly changes in the environment.
There are.
Is there, this is a very logical question, but is there ever a point that you think activists are going to be, quote, satisfied?
Well, I don't think the real issue is between shareholders and boards, actually. That's like saying, who's got more power, Congress or the electorate? You know, they're supposed to be our representatives. The real issue is shareholders themselves. It's among shareholders themselves. I vote, and I vote conscientiously. I put a lot of effort into it. I think a lot of funds vote kind of on a box-ticking nature, and also a lot of those funds don't want to, they have a conflict of interest. They want to run the 401ks and 457s of corporations, and so therefore they're reticent to vote against those corporations, and they're really reticent to announce their votes in advance of the meeting. So I don't think the real issue for me isn't between boards and shareholders, it's between shareholders and shareholders.
So you know, unfortunately this show isn't long enough. There's so many issues that I would like to understand how an activist processes those thoughts. But before you leave, I really want to ask you sort of, when you look at boardroom trends today, what sort of gives you encouragement when you see those trends, and what still concerns you? And we got probably about a minute and a half left, so I'm really curious to get your input on that.
Well, my concerns are still kind of gaming the system. And last year we had, we took care of I-9 as far as rules. If I filed a proposal and the board filed a proposal on the same subject, the SEC was allowing the corporation to keep my proposal off the ballot, saying, well, shareholders would be too confused if there's two proposals on the same subject. Well, that's bull, you know. So we got rid of that last year. This year, I'm looking at I-10, which says if the company has already put in, say if I file proxy access and the company has already enacted proxy access, then they try to make my proposal go away. But if they enacted bylaws that say, okay, shareholders can elect up to 20%, and I file to say up to 25%, the SEC shouldn't allow them to keep that off the proxy. Now, good things, the boards are communicating much more. The boards are becoming more diverse, very slowly, but they're getting there. And, you know, but again, I'd turn it back to investors, because on the investor side, what really I think is going to be pushing boards and helping boards is more and more funds are announcing their votes in advance of the meeting. So like CalPERS, I finally got them so that they are this year trying to announce all their votes in advance. Norges Bank, which is 2 or 3 times larger than CalPERS, they're moving in that direction. And if we ever come to the point where Fidelity, BlackRock, Vanguard, State Street, if they start announcing their votes in advance, then we will see the end to corporations as a democracy-free zone.
Well, Jim McRitchie, I can't thank you enough for taking the time. I wish we had more time to cover this, but I appreciate you taking the time to come join us on the show.
I'm glad you gave me the opportunity, TK.
And that will conclude this edition of Inside America's Boardrooms. We hope you enjoyed the show. We'll be back again next week when we take a look at another issue that'll help you be a better board member or committee member. So we'll see you then.
Join us again next week for Inside America's Boardrooms. Brought to you with Knowledge Partners, NASDAQ, the Center for Audit Quality, and PwC. Along with content contributors Equilar, Meridian Compensation Partners, Wilson Sonsini Goodrich and Rosati, R.R. Donnelly, and the Society of Corporate Secretaries and Governance Professionals.